talk about story point estimation guidelines. In the Agile methodology, we have learned that what is story point. But let's quickly repeat the concept of story points. So story points is nothing but it is the unit of measure of the work that we are going to do. So the stories that we are going to pick up, the amount of work that we are going to do against a specific story. It talks about the measure in terms of relative complexity of the work, right? So the story point, in summary, it denotes the level of complexity that is involved on this work compared to the amount of effort that we are going to put, right? So a story point, the number denotes how much effort are we going to put and how much is the complexity of this work, right? So the story point denote these two important points. As we know that it is generally expressed in the form of numbers, right? And the numbers are 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and so on, right? This is a very standard way of giving the points to a particular story. When the team discuss and denotes and agree on a point, the team will agree on the point based on the complexity and the amount of work, and then give a number to the story, right? Now, the important point here for all of us to understand is how do we come to a conclusion on a specific point, right? We do the poker planning that we all are aware. We discuss the complexity and the amount of work that we're going to do, and the team agrees on a number, which will be the final story point, the unit measure of the work for this particular story point. But there are some specific guidelines, right? These are just the guideline, and then team can also agree based on the nature of the work and project, right? But there are standard guidelines that has been given that how do we choose a particular story point starting from 1 to any number. Generally, it is between, generally the trend that we follow is like 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, right? But additionally, we also have 20 and 40 for higher complex items. Most likely, we do not go to 20 and 40 because the structure of our sprint is 2-week sprint, right? We mostly follow a 2-week sprint. At times in different projects, we also follow a 3-week sprint. More than that, we generally do not follow. And the objective of a sprint is to pick up a task and complete within that sprint, right? So if something is a story which is going to take more than 2 weeks, we try and break that into a smaller work, right? Or we carry forward that story into next sprint. That is the standard way. But let's focus only on point from 1 to 13 and see what are the standard guideline, right? So whenever a story is point 1, it's a one-pointer story, right? Ideally, the task should be completed within 1 day. And when we say that the task is completed within 1 day, it means that the development, testing, everything is completed, right? Not necessarily on the same day, right? When we say 1 day, not necessarily on the same day, but it should not take, say, more than 6 hours. The total effort on this story should not be more than 6 hours. For example, if a story is to fix something, development estimates the total effort for 3 hours, testing estimate the total effort for 2 hours, right? It's close to 1 day. So it's a one-pointer story. It appears that it is not very complex, right? So the story point would be one pointer. It's a one-pointer story, fairly simple, not very complex in terms of completing all the activity, right? A 2-pointer story is something that if the team estimate that this task is going to be completed in, say, within 12 hours or within, say, 10 to 12 hours, right? It's a 2-pointer story. It is going to take some more effort from the development end and some effort from the testing end to complete the activity, right? Generally, the way we break the stories into a sprint, the ideal scenario, the ideal case scenario is that we should be able to we should be able to create the story in such a way that one day, within a day, we are able to complete that story, which means that one story should not take more than 8 hours of effort, right? That is what is the ideal guideline. In sprint, we do not consider 8 hours of work because other than our normal work, we have some additional engagements also. So the actual productive hour is counted as 5 or 6 hours, right? But ideally, a task or a story should not take more than 8 hours to complete. This is how we should break. And that is the ideal story size. But if some of the stories are too long, like if it is going to take more time, we have to see if we can further break that story into smaller stories. If we cannot break it, then we have to see how much additional effort that we are going to take on that story, right? And accordingly, we have to give a complexity in terms of point to that story. If it is 3 points, it means that the effort is going to take 2 to 3 days, right? And so on and so forth for the other stories, other story points, right? A fairly complex story where the team has estimated that it is going to take, say, 5 to 10 working days, right? 10 days of effort, more than close to 50 hours of effort, right? It's a complex story, right? And then accordingly, we give the story points. So in simple terminology, when we are assigning a story point of 1, it means that the story is fairly simple, and we should be able to complete that story in one day. If a story point is fairly big, right, it is going to take 10 days of effort or 9 days of effort, which is ultimately, if you are following a 2 days sprint cycle, it means that it is going to take that entire sprint to complete that particular story, right? That is a very, very complex story. Then we have to give the highest story points, which is 13, right? In our slide, you also see a story points like 20 and 40, but always remember that we follow a sprint cycle mostly of 2 weeks, right? 2 to 3 weeks. Standard guideline is that we follow a sprint cycle of 2 weeks, and something which we are not able to complete within 2 weeks it means that we have to see how can we further break that story into smaller stories. This activity should ideally be done when we are doing the product backlog refinement meeting, where team has clear understanding of the requirement and team agrees that how much effort are we going to put. And during that refinement meeting, if we see that this is a complex story which is going to take good amount of time, which may cross within a sprint, we have to see the alternate ways of breaking that big piece of requirement to smaller requirement and then accordingly agree. In a particular sprint, we should not have many stories having story points like 5, 8, and 13. It means that a lot of complex items we have taken in the sprint, and at the end of the sprint, we might not be able to achieve the objective of that sprint. So try and break your story into smaller pieces. The ideal case scenario is one story, 1 day of work, 1 day of effort in completing it, right? Again, remember that 1 day of effort does not mean that everything is getting completed within the same day. In terms of hour, it should not take more than 8 hours, right? So maybe on day 1, the developer has taken 4 hours to complete, and when it is ready for the QA might take test within the same day if it is deployed to the QA environment, or the QA might test in next day when it is available. So the total effort that we are putting, and by that time it is done from the development, the developer can go ahead and take another story and start working on it. But in the meantime, QA is ready with the with these scenarios within the environment, and when it is deployed, when the story is deployed, they test and then validate it. So this is how we should ideally move. But we have to make sure that we are considering the total effort that we are going to put on the stories in terms of complexity and effort. Right? So the standard guideline that you see on this slide is just for our reference purpose. There's no hard and fast rule that we should abide by these conditions, but whenever we are estimating, understanding and estimating a story, and we are going to give a story point to measure the complexity and the effort, we should keep this point in mind in terms of hours of effort that we are going to put in this story, right? Feel free to reach out to us to learn more on quick agile techniques. We are also running different programs on agile methodology. Thank you very much for listening.